Hope everyone's having a great day. Thank you all for coming and attending this talk. Um, so, the title of the talk really addresses the issue of intersectionality, and this is an important topic. I'm so happy that the conference has dedicated a section for looking at intersectional issues. Um, the other speakers are speaking on some important topics related to intersectionality. And hopefully, I will be able to add some things to this issue as well. So, climate and food are related in many ways. And one of the pernicious aspects of this relationship is how it affects people of color, especially people of color in the underdeveloped South. This could be minority communities located in the North, or as well as people of color in the global South. There are many ways how climate and food intersects with people of color. Um, a lot of people have written on food deserts in the global North. Lauren Ornelas, who is, I think, scheduled to speak, she has done wonderful work on the kind of lack of access and food insecurity that poor minority communities face in terms of getting healthy food. Others have written on the effects of environmental racism and how people of color are impacted by big agriculture, factory farms, and other industries related to food are located in often in poor minority communities. One of the areas that's very difficult is the erosion of land rights in the global South. As big pharma has spread to gain larger and larger areas for soy production and feed, animal feed, in the global South, we have seen a dramatic increase in landlessness. For example, in places like Argentina, Ecuador, other countries in South America, at the time of independence, 90% of the population were independent landholders. We're at a point now that figure is reversed. Now, 90% of those communities are landless. So the evasion of local indigenous land rights leads to a massive migration problem. Um, Local migration, regional migration, national migration, and international migration. And migration has particular issues as well related to food and climate. indigenous people are local people with access to land, are often self-sustaining, self-sufficient, and as they become landless and move to cities, urban towns, their consumption and climate footprint increases considerably. There is even a shift in diet as a result of the penetration of big agriculture and factory farms into urban areas and cities. So people who, local, third world, indigenous peoples and communities who before may have eaten a fairly healthy plant-based protein diet are soon converted to predominant animal-based fast food diets in urban areas and local cities. Communities that once had very little problems with chronic diseases are now facing the same health issues that people in the global north have faced for the last 40 or 50 years as the diets and increases in animal consumption have affected their health. One of the areas where migration and climate change is particularly related is when we look at seafood in Asia. There's been some documentation in this in the mainstream media, but so as sea levels rise, displacing numerous coastal communities across underdeveloped countries in Southeastern Asia, like Cambodia, Myanmar, and other countries. The coastal communities are becoming landless, and they are now also migrants. Many often end up in Thailand, where there's tremendous problems with enslavement. The Thai government, local police often work in collusion with regional and national seafood corporations. Many times, migrants are captured and kept in very unsanitary, primitive conditions. They're locked into these processing centers. And if they escape, the Thai authorities would return them to the factory owners. So we have whole families of Cambodian and other migrants captured in Thailand, working in factories, primarily processing seafood. Shrimp processing enslaves tens of thousands of migrants in factories all across Thailand. Thailand has some of the largest seafood companies with subcontractors located all across the countryside. In addition to the enslavement of women, children, and on the land in coastal processing facilities, there's a tremendous of enslavement on the seas as well. Migrants are once again enticed to work on fishing trawlers with promises of wages, um, other resources. Many find themselves trapped, unable to leave because they're on the sea. And so they're caught at months for months working without wages. And there's problems of violence as well as many communities killed. So seafood is having a serious impact on human rights in Asia. And this, as I said, is related to climate and sea level rise. But as climate affects more disadvantaged and underprivileged communities in the global south, this will in turn lead to more vulnerable communities migrating and thus putting themselves at risk for further exploitation. Trafficking is another issue that is related to big agriculture, with landlessness and other problems related to the incursion of big food companies into the global south. This is leading to an increase in trafficking. Another area of intersectionality between climate and food relates to the effects of climate change itself. So it turns out that climate and climate change does not affect everyone equally. Those who are least responsible for causing this problem, a problem primarily caused by developed Western-based companies in the global north, who are probably responsible for 80% so far of greenhouse gases, man-made greenhouse gases. The people of the global south have not done much to contribute to climate change. However, they will suffer from the most severe effects. As the climate warms, vast majorities of people of color who live on the equatorial belt will suffer from extreme heat and other extreme abrupt effects. We've already seen the migration crisis coming out from the Middle East. Some agriculturalists have written about the link of big agriculture and the civil war in Syria. They have shown that as urban capitalists expanded livestock production in the fragile grasslands in rural Syria, local farmers and agriculturalists were displaced. Very soon, the land was rendered marginal and unavailable for many other local uses. This led to a crisis and to the local rebellions we see occurred in Syria. Other aspects of livestock production is also affecting conflict in Ethiopia and parts of northwestern Africa. A lot of these issues are not necessarily discussed when we talk about climate or food. A lot of the local, regional, and international aid agencies encourage and support livestock production as one way of elevating third world poverty. As the climate changes and warming intensifies, this will have a really negative impact on people in the third world. We see the process that occurs when the climate changes and how local communities adapt. The last things they sell is livestock because their livestock is probably their most valuable possessions. And so as drought intensifies, we see them, um, the animals dying, and then the people being left without very little resources. Formerly, they may have been agriculturalists with access to dry weather crops and so be able to survive extreme weather changes. But as the local economies move to livestock production, communities are faced with even more severe effects as a result of climate change. So far we talked about the intersection of food with neocolonialism, the erosion of indigenous land rights across the global south. We spoke about the connection to enslavement, human enslavement in aspects of livestock production, especially seafood. We talk about the increase in trafficking, how this affects women and gender rights. We talked about food deserts, how this affects local communities, minority communities, also in the global north. And we talked about how climate itself and climate change will affect people of color, the poor, more than people who are actually responsible for causing climate change. If the audience has any questions.
All right.
Yes?
Are there any questions? Here we go. I'll just bring a mic over to you.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I'm from the U.S., and a lot of people in the U.S., especially like people in my family, are, most non-vegetarians or vegans. They say that veganism is, a first world fad, that like only people, like privileged people, can do it. And it kind of just made me think when you were speaking about, all the, you know, slavery that goes on in third world countries with, connected to animal agriculture and just the cheapest foods possible being non-animal products in most cases. How do you think, like, what bullet points could I say, or could somebody say, when combating that argument of like you're just a hipster, rather than like you're actually doing something that is, it's actually the opposite of being privileged. It's like, simplifying means for the greater good.
Thank you. That's a good question. Um, so, food insecurity globally is related to increasing animal consumption. We find as animal consumption increases, the food insecurity in general for a vast majority of people increases. If the world were to go plant-based, we would solve a lot of the food insecurity issues. A lot of the land resources are utilized for animal-based production. So that's one of the issues, is linking diet with food insecurity in the global south, to show that the Western-based animal-based diet actually causes poverty and hunger to people who don't have access to land and other resources as a result of animal-based production. The other thing that I think is related is the footprint issue. And this addresses, I think, more head on the hipster argument. So the people who are most um, having the best footprint are plant-based people in the global south. They have the solution that we should be heading towards. They eat a primarily plant-based diet. So if people in the global north were to accept and follow the diet of people in the global south, the climate crisis can be solved. What we're seeing is the opposite, where trade agreements and big agricultural corporations, food corporations, are pushing Western-based diets into the global south. The idea of eating a plant-based diet as a privileged position doesn't make any sense in the global south. These communities have consumed plant-based protein for thousands of years. it is not a privileged position to say that we should eat more like them.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Yes?
Yeah. There's a lot of like vegan meat and vegan cheese companies that I think come out of the capitalist Western system of like wanting to provide, seeing an opening for transitioning vegans or people who just want meat and cheese that's plant-based. Do you think that do you think it'd be a good argument to argue that you're just angry at capitalism rather than veganism in that sense? I mean, it's like you're just angry at the system of like, oh, there's a market for this plant-based meat and cheese rather than, a whole foods plant-based diet, which is more economical and, financially suitable or financially like those in disadvantaged communities.
I think there is something to that. I agree that whole base foods are certainly the way to go. And the trend towards highly processed plant-based foods is sort of the same trend we see with the processed high-fat, high-sugar foods in traditional food business. So if we're going to do plant-based foods, we could try to do them differently, as perhaps the organic agriculturalists have tried to separate themselves from chemical-based farming. Also, there's one thing about quote-unquote humane meat and other plant-based foods. The more processing is obviously a higher footprint. A lot of times we're not aware of the CO2 and other greenhouse gas that were used for production. Soy is a common ingredient, and the soy processing is pretty intensified, carbon-based. It uses quite a bit of fossil to hull the soy seed to separate it, the wheat germ from the rest of the soy product.
Hi, my name is Ian. So I actually think that we would need a seismic change to go from where we currently are to have a world community which is plant-based in terms of its food. So I'm constantly looking for some messages or something that gives me a link to think that there is some changes, and just currently looking around some work where rather than measuring a country's output in GDP, gross domestic product, we're looking to add to it a measure around social well-being. And I just wondered if you could see a link between the world's economies measuring countries' output rather than being just about financial domestic product, and rather around well-being and how that might fit with the vegan intersectionalist view.
That's an interesting question. The Nutritionists have had a look at this. There are a couple of books written on diet, national diet, local diet, and health. I think one person looked at an area she called blue zones, and people who live the longest use plant-based proteins, especially beans. There are other aspects of quality of life that you could include, but certainly from the health aspect, there are studies that show that plant-based communities are healthier.
Hi. I was just wondering, as you're saying, veganism doesn't necessarily seem like it has to be a privileged position, but I think, especially in the West, we are in a privileged position. And that's what kind of came, that's why I kind of view veganism as almost like a duty in the West to try as hard as we can within the system we live in to bring down our footprint. But I was wondering what you think of as a kind of intersectional aspect of veganism. You spoke a little bit about people who might have a very low carbon footprint but rely on livestock. And I was wondering what you thought of sort of vegans having kind of solidarity with maybe Indigenous people who do hunt or who do kill animals, but simply because it's actually better for the planet and, I don't know, maybe better for the system for them to continue with that way of life rather than to transition to a Western capitalist kind of going to the supermarket style thing while being vegan. So it's better for them to continue with that way of life. And I was wondering what you thought about, solidarity with people who hunt or who have ways of life that might hurt animals but potentially be in a way better than being in our system. I don't know. It's a bit iffy. I'm not even sure what I think about it.
Thank you. This is a serious issue, and there's several ways to look at it. So I guess primarily the first way is to say that this is a small part of consumption. So let's look at the major factory farm and that kind of consumption before we start looking at local indigenous practices. The vast majority of the problem is not within their communities. So we need to address the main cause and the main problems first. And this is sort of, in many ways, taking us away from that. It's avoidance of the main cause. Nevertheless, this is a critical issue, and we see this as a form of, or framed as a form of, cultural imperialism, cultural appropriation, and other ways of how Western-based activists intersect with indigenous groups. There are some supposedly radical green organizations that come out from the deep ecology movement, and these activists have embraced indigenous dietary practices as the ideal diet. And this has linked with the paleo diet craze. I have taken some time to address this issue. First, we've looked at how indigenous diet itself has changed. We looked at the anthropology of how indigenous diets are looked at and analyzed. We look at studies that show gender differences in indigenous food production. So, for example, among quote unquote gatherer hunters communities, we find that 70% of those communities' food is plant-based and gathered primarily by women and children. If these communities relied on hunting as a main form of food production, they would have a lot of problems. It takes a lot of energy and resources to hunt. Gathering is something that's much more stable and supporting. So we first have to deconstruct the myths about indigenous diet. And there's some work on this, looking at how indigenous people have developed all the hundreds of varieties of plant-based foods in the last 500 years in North and South America, and were primarily plant-based. The Western narrative of indigenous as quote unquote primitive hunters has really led to a lot of misunderstandings regarding indigenous diets. There is no ideal paleo diet or diet from the Paleolithic era. And the Paleolithic era has had human communities in the Paleolithic area have consumed plant-based foods as their main form of food. So one issue I haven't really addressed that in terms of intersectionality and climate is gender and women. So it turns out that 3/4 of the world's population are women and children. But often when we talk about diet, this vast percentage is subsumed under human or other labels. We need to really separate out women and children, not only in food production, consumption, but also how climate change will affect women and children in particular. There is a link between masculinity and increasing animal consumption. The link of animal-based protein with masculinity is something that has developed particularly strong in the last 100 years. This has a racial component, as Western white imperialists have linked animal-based protein to racial superiority. And people in the global South or non-Western European countries who primarily consume plant-based protein are viewed as inferior from a masculine perspective, which also translates into a historical and civilizational perspective. In the book, Meet Climate Change, we even talk about an Anglosphere of consumption and climate footprints, especially if we look at Australia being at the top in terms of animal-based consumption. So many studies have shown that women have very different views on nutrition and protein consumption than men. These differences are noted by researchers in Europe, America, and Australia. There could be significant differences in terms of consumption of animal-based proteins by women and by men. Many advocates and nutritional outreach and approaches have failed to address these significant differences in consumption. I have argued that we need to look at how meat consumption interlinks with masculinity and address this from a more gender sensitive context. Also, the problem of gender and women in terms of climate change is something that is a serious one. After disaster, or even during a disaster, many of them say weather related, we find that women and children are most affected. In the tsunamis that occurred in Asia, 3 out of the 4 people who died were women and children. In disaster, women often wait on instructions of the men, and men are often better to avoid effects of severe weather. In the aftermath of disaster, women are more vulnerable to the desperate effects that communities try to use to adapt. So climate, food, and women are some things we have to look more seriously at as abrupt climate change increases. So if I may talk a little bit about my book, Meet Climate Change, the second leading cause of global warming. Meet Climate Change is one of the most relevant books of our times and a blueprint for human survival. Climate warming is a clear and present danger, and food is the second leading cause next to fossil fuel. Demand for animal products is projected to increase 50% from 2013 to 2025 and 70% by 2050. Even if the world went fossil free by 2100, increasing animal consumption will continue to cause catastrophic global warming. This point is something that is critical and needs to be addressed at the intergovernmental level in a more serious way. In the book, we looked at the Paris Climate Agreement and the plans that national economies are making to reduce their climate footprints. Unfortunately, animal agriculture and animal consumption is not really included as part of national plans for climate mitigation. Many of the reports that are issued by the IPCC and the UN Climate Organization does not address increasing animal consumption. It turns out that animal consumption has very serious short-term impacts, particularly related to methane and nitrous oxide, which are more potent greenhouse gases than carbon dioxide, and so have a much more powerful short-term effect. Increasing animal consumption and releases of nitrous oxide and methane could get us to a tipping point much faster than the release of fossil fuels. If we were to address animal consumption and reduce the releases of methane and nitrous oxide, it may give us more time to deal with the effects of CO2. Unfortunately, the climate mitigation efforts focus on CO2, and methane from animal production and nitrous oxide are hardly discussed. I think just a few days ago, there was a huge press meeting and hoopla about reducing CFCs, the highly potent gases, greenhouse gases, CFCs, carbofluorogases, but they're a very small part of the greenhouse gas picture. CFCs are about 1 or 2% of total man-made greenhouse gases, Nitrous oxide is close to 10%, and methane from animal agriculture is probably at about 15 or 20%. In addition, there are CO2 releases from animal production as well. So the real danger is the increasing animal consumption in the global south. While they have a far way to catch up to us in the global north, even a small increase among large numbers of people will obviously lead to more greenhouse gases. However, our efforts must focus on the main problem: the consumers of animal-based products in the global north. Our climate footprint is huge, vastly out, larger than those in the global south. If we are to do anything towards climate mitigation, we have to take the lead and reduce our footprints to that of those in the south. The most amount of mitigation can come from reducing consumption in Western-based developed countries.